Welcome to Shelf Help, a channel dedicated to talking to the void about whatever book I happen to be reading. I'm your host, the reader. The following review will contain spoilers. I know this is late for a Halloween episode. In my defense, I've been working a lot of overtime, and my country has been dancing with dictatorship. It's been a week here in the States. It's kinda been a week since, March. Anyway, I'm gonna be honest, I got this book on a lark. This sounds like a book that should have a yakety-sax soundtrack, but it was surprisingly insidious. There's no mystery who the vampire is, and it is a real vampire. The problem is overcoming a massive amount of gaslighting and a monster who's had centuries of practice at manipulating people. Patricia is a housewife in the mid-90s. She's married to a doctor, has 2 children and a dog, and lives in an exclusive neighborhood. And she's bored out of her skull. It's not that she doesn't love her family. She just needs adult conversation. So she joins a book club. The first meeting is a disaster. The book is painfully dull, and she just can't make the time to read it. But she does meet some other women who break away and start their own book club, reading mostly true crime. For years, that's exactly what she needed. The women, despite being very different people, get along famously. When Patricia's mother-in-law slides deeper into dementia and becomes too much, the other women come to her rescue. And then an elderly neighbor goes feral and bites Patricia's ear off. Enter the vampire, James Harris, posing as the woman's nephew. As I said, there's no mystery who the vampire is. Patricia sees him feeding on a little girl fairly early in the story. The bulk of the story is between James's manipulation and Patricia's faith in her own eyes. James is about 400 years old and has been using the same song and dance all that time. He arrives in a town, quickly ingratiates himself to the men. He even says himself, "All you have to be is a white man with money, and people fall in line." He convinces them to invest in whatever scheme he has, fleeces them of their money while feeding on the children, and when things go south, he vanishes. Miss Mary, Patricia's mother-in-law, was even from a town he visited decades ago. He called himself Hoyt Pickens then. He convinced them to invest money in turning moonshine into bourbon. When they became suspicious of the children missing and dead, he convinced them to blame a mentally disabled black man. The villagers buried him alive under a peach tree. Next day, Hoyt vanishes, never to be seen or heard from again, leaving everyone broke and guilty. In Patricia's time, it's real estate and the children of 6 Mile, a tiny, extremely poor black community. As their children die or commit suicide or taken by the state because of weird track marks on their inner thigh, that land is bought up on the cheap for more development. The commentary on racism and how not a whole lot has changed is on full display here. Even when Patricia cares, it's apparent that the others just don't. It's not that they're bad people. It's that they're rich white people. The realities of being poor and black in the South just don't register. Patricia eventually convinces her book club to help, until their husbands step in. Speaking of which, there's a second vampire in the story. His name is Carter, and he's Patricia's husband. He's not the blood-drinking kind like James. He's the gaslighting son of a bitch that at some point every woman is stupid enough to date. I'll get back to that. James knew what the women would do, even before he was discovered by Patricia, and he was laying the groundwork. He lined the men's pockets with cash and investment dreams, while plying them with drinks at the yacht club. This is not his first spin around the block, as it were. So when Patricia gathers her book club to make her accusation of child molestation, because vampire wasn't going to fly, obviously, their husbands rally to defense of their friend. These upstanding men of the community The gaslighter, the wife-beater, the jobless, the religious zealot, and the disgraced cop just can't be associated with such ugliness. It would reflect badly on them and hurt their image and investments. And these things are just way more important than what happens to some poor black children. After they shame and intimidate their wives into submission, they surprise them by bringing James along to receive a personal apology. This book has a lot to unpack. Wealth, privilege, racism, sexism. In my last review, I said that themes need to be built into a story, not a story built around its themes. This is a really good example of what I mean. None of these words are actually used, but they are glaringly present. Miss Green is an at-home nurse for Patricia and a maid for her friend Grace, as well as for James Harris. She also lives in 6 Mile, the rundown trailer park composed of black families who either work for the wealthy white families or take unemployment. 6 Mile is James Harris's favorite feeding ground, because as Miss Green puts it, when poor black kids die or go missing, the police just write it off as poor black folk being poor black folk. And that's exactly what happens. Found dead of exposure in the middle of summer? Drugs. Had face smashed in on a tree. Drug deal gone bad. Slit throat with a butcher knife, or stepped in front of a truck. Definitely drugs. No need to investigate any of this. This is completely normal behavior for children under the age of 10. By the way, did I mention James Harris feeds from the inner thigh? Mostly girls. Some boys and women too. As far as I can tell, he's not feeding on the men. But he has implied that he has no issue with straight murder, and why waste the blood? This thing has layers. And after Patricia's failed attempt to have him arrested or run out of town, the husband forced their wives to allow him into the book club. When we jump forward a few years, their small, all-wives book club for reading true crime novels is now crowded with husbands and reading Tom Clancy novels. Let me get back to Carter, Patricia's husband. While James Harris is a manipulative little tick, Carter is a gaslighting little prick. He's also the sort of life-sucking vampire you can meet in real life. We see the signs early on. How much work Patricia does all on her own, raising 2 kids and keeping the house in order. Carter demands his mother-in-law live with them, but never raises a finger to help. Not even as her mental decline takes a toll on his wife and children. It's even in his little actions. He asks which tie he should wear, and deliberately chooses the opposite of Patricia's advice. He gives her nice earrings for their anniversary, instead of something cheap from a local big box, only for her to learn he'd gotten them free at work. Keep in mind he's a doctor, and they live in an exclusive neighborhood. When the house was nearly broken into one night, he only keeps his promise to be home before dark for 2 nights before returning to his late nights at work. He does no chores, to the point he even leaves his dishes on the table after meals. He knows nothing about his children. When his wife tells him she saw his friend do something unspeakable to a little girl, and she is calling the police, his response is to go to said friend. Because we all know that when confronted, monsters instantly confess. He gathers all the husbands, and they jump to protect their friend. They ambush their wives, cut them off from the police, shame them, and force them to apologize for wanting the police to investigate child molestation. And then he takes it a few steps further, because nothing is more important than his image and his career. Fuck this guy. And more importantly, never ever fuck this guy. So how does it end? Well, as the first slide of the prologue says, this story ends in blood. I'll tell you how. That would ruin the satisfying and delightfully creepy ending. I'm going to make this one a reader's choice. It's a wonderful layer cake of creeping horror. Vampires have moved from the terrifying Nosferatu to the sparkly Twilight. They have become sex symbols. And I get it. People meet after dark, body parts extend, there's penetration, and fluids are exchanged. It ain't rocket science. But it is nice to see vampires getting back to their roots as monsters. The fact that James Harris employs such sinister and familiar manipulation just makes him all the more insidious. Thank you for your time. I know everyone's mileage will vary, so feel free to leave your thoughts.